Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on measuring and managing Scope 3 emissions. This is the second webinar in our Getting to Net Zero for Cities and Regions series for the public sector, with Carbon Trust experts deep diving into emerging topics. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's webinar. You've joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit your questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. You can send in your questions at any time during the presentation, and we will collect these and address them during the audience Q&A session at the end or afterwards via email.
Thanks very much, Maddie. Good morning, everyone. My name is Rob Hatcher. Thank you all very much for taking time to be with us today. And welcome to this second session in our webinar series, where we'll be deep diving into various elements related to net zero for cities and regions. So today we'll explore Scope 3 emissions as they relate to public sector bodies on an organisational level, and talk about some of the details related to Scope 3 fundamentals, such as measuring Scope 3 emissions, and what also can be done to start to tackle those emissions. So the format is to take you through a presentation, which will include some background on drivers to managing Scope 3 emissions, Scope 3 categorization as per the GHG protocol, and Scope 3 measurement methodologies and supply chain engagement activities in reference to public sector bodies. We'll leave time at the end of the session to try and get through any questions there may be, wrapping up at 11 a.m. So first of all, we'll just quickly introduce ourselves. So as I said, my name is Rob Hatcher. I'm a senior manager in the Carbon Trust Cities and Regions team. And that's a part of the business that supports cities and regions and public bodies to address the climate emergency through strategic, technical, financial, and implementation focused support. And I lead on our organisational level support for local authorities and other public sector bodies on climate action planning and net zero strategy, with a focus on carbon footprinting, project pipeline development and decarbonisation pathways. I'm joined by my colleague today, Hector. Hector, would you like to introduce yourself quickly?
Yeah, great, thanks, Rob. And good morning, everyone. My name's Hector Wilson, and I'm an associate here in our Cities and Regions team. I'm mainly involved in the technical and analytical side of the work that we carry out here. And I've been working on public sector projects for 3 odd years now, helping to reduce carbon footprints, develop climate action plans, and create scenario models for public sector bodies. If we head into the next slide, I'll give us a brief introduction to the team and the Carbon Trust. And before we head into the main content of the webinar today, just like to share a couple of pieces of information with you all. So the Carbon Trust's mission is to accelerate the transition to a low carbon economy. And the Cities and Regions team works towards this mission specifically with obviously cities, regions, and the public sector in mind. We're a team of about 25 people based in London, Cardiff, and Edinburgh. And our team have a wide range of skills and capabilities. We have colleagues that have very deep technical and commercial knowledge, as well as colleagues with expertise in project management, strategy development, and stakeholder engagement. Since 2001, we've worked with over 3,000 public sector organisations, and our projects with local government and the public sector help them to develop their approach to climate action. Many of our projects focus in accelerating the development and delivery of clean energy and carbon reduction at local and regional levels. And this includes setting science-based targets, developing net zero action plans, and helping regions to be more ambitious with respect to addressing climate change. The second piece of information that I have is that today's webinar is the second webinar in a series of 4. Last month, we ran the first of our webinars on aligning climate action plans with net zero. And if you missed it, you can access the recording by signing up online on our website. And the next webinars that we have coming up are implementing climate action plans in September and climate change adaptation in October. So if you're interested in any of those areas, then please do keep an eye out for an announcement on LinkedIn, Twitter, our Carbon Trust newsletter, or indeed the Carbon Trust website. This is mainly as a reminder, so this slide sets out what we believe to be a sensible overarching approach and framework for how a climate declaration may be taken forward. Many of these key areas, these key steps still need to be followed when footprinting and reducing Scope 3 emissions. We'll look to cover these key stages in the remainder of this webinar and hopefully answer some key questions that need to be answered. So these may include initial scoping and definition of your aims and vision. So that's what are we trying to achieve? Are we talking about our own organisation, talking about our region? And which Scope 3 emission sources should we look to cover? Moving on, we've got the footprinting and baseline setting. So this is understanding your existing emissions and how they're likely to change with time. And then we can start to make an informed decision about target setting, defining what a suitable target is and when it needs to be achieved. We then move forward into an action plan development stage. So this includes what actions may need to be taken. Do we need to engage suppliers? How do we bring in all relevant stakeholders? And finally, the last stage, monitoring and evaluation. So this is tracking progress against targets and ensuring that a suitable governance structure is in place. For those that have previously developed carbon management, energy or climate action strategies for their organisations or regions, some of the elements of this framework hopefully should be familiar. And hopefully you can take away some learnings from today on how to build upon your existing plan or indeed develop a new plan that includes Scope 3 emissions. I'll now hand back over to Rob to take us through the categorisation of emissions and the drivers for undertaking this work. Back over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Hector. So in this section, I'll briefly run through, as Hector says, the drivers and the benefits as we see it for Scope 3 measurement and management, and then outline some of the fundamentals in terms of Scope 3 categorisation as they relate to public bodies and local authorities, which should tee us up to talk through doing Scope 3 measurement. So why bother with measuring and managing Scope 3 emissions at all? Well, apart from the fairly known point that Scope 3 emissions are almost always on an organisational level the largest proportion of emissions, there are other drivers and benefits involved. For starters, your organisation may have made a climate emergency declaration recently, which may have directly or indirectly committed to reducing emissions beyond just Scope 1 and 2. And we've seen various versions of wording related to the declarations that either specifically name Scope 3 as a target area or leave it ambiguous enough that it could be argued that Scope 3 should be covered in whatever commitment has been made. Another area is that measurement will allow you to better understand where to focus your efforts. It's generally too big to tackle all at once, so you need to prioritise. And we'll say a bit more about that as we go through. Once you've prioritised where to focus efforts, you can then engage those areas such as particular suppliers that account for a significant proportion of the emissions. A better understanding of supply chain emissions will subsequently allow you to develop metrics that then you can use to work with suppliers to help you to decarbonize your supply chain. Using those metrics then, another benefit is that you can track your supply chain emissions much more accurately and specifically, which can then allow you to communicate your progress internally and externally as well. Finally, you never know what's around the corner, as this year has certainly proven. Scope 3 emissions may be subject to future regulatory scrutiny. And if you don't believe that, then at least by proactively managing your Scope 3 emissions sooner than later, you'll be able to demonstrate leadership at the local community level or otherwise in this area. So the majority of public sector bodies we've worked with over the years, and certainly more recently, have taken and are moving towards significant reductions from Scope 1 and 2 emission sources from their own operation and estate. And this, of course, relates to decarbonising buildings through energy efficiency, on-site renewables, but also making now decisions around electrifying heat, electrifying vehicles, and really taking advantage of the ever-reducing grid emissions factor and the decreasing cost of renewables. But we're not talking about Scope 1 and 2 today. We're talking about an organisation's Scope 3 emissions, of which you can see the 15 categories defined by the GHG protocol here. It certainly seems like a long list of potential emission sources, and coupled with measurement issues and its inherent indirect nature, we see the majority of public sector bodies, and then many privates too, have left this area relatively untackled. Hopefully we can make this seem a little bit more achievable today by breaking a few things down for you, however. We're not going to run through each of these emission sources individually. In fact, there's a number here that are just not relevant for public bodies, which we'll talk through in a second. But a key point of the terminology that's useful to be aware of is upstream and downstream. And this can broadly be described as upstream are things that an organisation buys, and downstream are things that an organisation sells. In general, we expect there to be less downstream emissions for public sector, service-based, local authority organisations, which are the categories you can see on the right-hand side of the box. Generally, only really downstream leased assets and investments are relevant. Upstream, however, such as those related to purchased goods and services, capital goods, indirect transport-related emission sources, waste, and other ones you can see there, are all potentially significant parts of a local authority's Scope 3 organisational footprint. So, what to include and how are all important questions that we'll hopefully touch on and provide a bit of information on today. So the reason why the GHG protocol has a number of non-relevant emission sources for public bodies is because of the allowance for the categories for those businesses that exist in the private and the manufacturing sectors that have downstream impacts related to the distribution, the use, the processing, and the end of life of their products that they create. So on this slide, you can see the cradle to grave impacts across the supply and value chain of a business that creates products. So going from left to right broadly, raw materials are extracted and then developed into products, and then distributed and used, and then eventually disposed of. So this slide is just another way of looking at the categories of Scope 3. All 15 of them are in there, and the potential impacts. We've also got Scope 1 and 2 in the middle there, you can see as well. For the public sector, things are a little different and generally a little more straightforward, you'll be glad to hear. So this slide shows what we see as typically relevant when considering emission sources across Scope 3 for public sector organisations. And that's not to say that you can completely discount the emission sources removed from the last slide without the appropriate screening, but this is what we'd typically expect to see. In the main, it's pretty much all in the supply chain, the upstream side of things. So the only sort of primary downstream impact is potentially significant, say for a local authority, is the use of leased assets and investments comes into that as well. And in that example, it would be buildings that are owned by a local authority, for example, and then leased out to other businesses or tenants. Upstream impacts, as I mentioned, such as those related to purchased goods and services, capital goods, which is effectively construction, upstream impacts related to energy consumption, which are the green arrows in the middle there, business travel, employee commuting, waste, and also investments comes into that as well, can all very much potentially be significant for your organisation in this area. So before we get into talking about measuring Scope 3 emissions, I just want to say a couple more things about the target categories. So a key difference between measuring Scope 1 and 2 emissions and Scope 3 is that we would say that measuring Scope 3 needs to be evolved and developed over time due to its inherent sort of indirect nature, as I've said, as opposed to Scope 1 and 2, where you own the data and you can apply emissions factors fairly readily. Scope 3 in many cases follows a different path, and we'll go into that a little bit more next. What this slide shows is those previously mentioned emission sources relevant for public bodies, and an example exercise that we've done in terms of impact to those emissions against the organisation's ability to influence those emissions. And those are perhaps the two main factors that influence what emission sources you should prioritise for measurement and subsequent action. In this example, you can see that the purchased goods and services, capital goods, high impact source of emissions, but difficult to influence. Whereas employee commuting, business travel, waste, upstream energy, more easily influenced, but had a lower carbon impact. Actually, investments is an area that potentially has good potential for it has a high carbon impact potentially and a relatively higher level of influence, at least in this example. So conducting an exercise like this can help to crystallize things somewhat. So before I hand back over to Hector to talk through the measurement side of things in more detail, I just wanted to draw attention to a couple of other considerations when prioritizing and selecting emissions. So this is taken from the GHG protocol guidance on selecting emission sources, and you'll see that size and influence, impact and influence are at the top of the list. However, there are other areas that we see as potentially particularly relevant for public bodies to also think about, and that is stakeholders and spend or expenditure. And those emission sources that lie in areas that are deemed critical by key stakeholders, for example, like waste that has actually quite a high environmental profile, it may need to come under perhaps closer scrutiny, even if the relative carbon impact is lower all through the carbon lens. And of course, those areas where high expenditure exists are certainly worth a closer look for obvious reasons. Of course, certain emission sources may account for any number or all of these factors all in one, but others, they might not. So it's worth considering these guidance criteria before diving in. Okay, so I'll pass over to Hector for the next section.
Brilliant, thanks, Rob. So in this next section, we're going to discuss how we actually measure your Scope 3 footprint, the different methodologies that are available to us to do this, and some of the benefits and disadvantages of each. So to calculate your Scope 3 emissions, first of all, you need to know the emission factor for the source of the emissions that you're analysing. And for those who aren't familiar, what an emission factor is, this is the mass of carbon dioxide that's emitted per unit of an activity. So as an example, this could be the grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour of electricity consumed, or it could be the tons of CO2 that's produced per product that's created. And there are two predominant approaches that we use to find the emission factor for a Scope 3 source. These are the life cycle assessment, or LCA method, and the environmentally extended input-output, or EEIO method. The LCA approach looks at the emissions produced at every stage of a product's life cycle. So this will be from manufacturing and processing to when it's actually being used, and to eventually how that product is disposed. And all in all, this results in a highly accurate emissions factor that's specific to that product or activity. The flip side being that generally this requires a more significant amount of work, as well as strong background knowledge to the life cycle of that product or activity. If we look on the other hand at the EIO method, this creates an emission factor in terms of how much money is actually spent on that product or activity. We calculate this factor from looking at the emissions produced and general amount of investment within a specific industry, sector, or subsector. And the result from this is that we have an emission factor that's easier to use and quicker to apply, but it therefore does lack the level of detail and granularity and specificity that's achieved through the LCA approach. Determining which approach to use is dependent on several factors. And these may include how much time you have, how much budget, resource, and effort you have, your familiarity with Scope 3 reporting, and most importantly, what data is available to you. This example here is a decision tree for the purchase goods and services Scope 3 category. And the first step in the process is to understand what data is available. If volumetric data is available, so when we say volumetric data, this is the specific data of that activity. So for example, the tons of waste, then an LCA emission factor can be used. This is often easier said than done. Obtaining this specific activity data from a supplier or contractor can often be difficult to acquire. It may be that there isn't that level of engagement with the supplier or contractor, or it might be that it's just simply not collected by them in the first place. However, if we look at the next branch down on this decision tree, if the volumetric or activity data isn't available, then we can start looking at the spend data. And we have two options here. The emission factor may be available from the supplier themselves. Some companies do produce their own emission factor if they undertake their own footprinting. Otherwise, we can use a sector or subsector specific EIO emission factor. Generally, for most organizations, the reality is that a mix of these different approaches will probably be used, entirely dependent on what data is available to yourselves. So as mentioned previously, one of the factors that may determine which approach is most suitable to your organization is your familiarity with Scope 3 emission reporting. If you've never undertaken a Scope 3 footprint before, then the sector-wide EIO approach may be most appropriate for first-timers. It's quicker to undertake, the data is generally easier to come by, as most organizations will collect that spend data. It may be a less accurate method, but generally this is okay if you're just simply looking to understand the initial scale of your footprint. However, As you become more familiar with this and you might start undertaking Scope 3 footprinting annually, then generally the structure that you need to collect the data is more set in stone. And it's recommended that you then move to increasingly more accurate methods of footprinting. So this might mean moving to company-specific and then eventually service-specific emission factors. And generally, this will require more engagement with suppliers, which Rob will talk about again later on in this webinar. So I've mentioned EIO emission factors a few times now, and I'd just like to take a very brief moment to describe them in a bit more detail. In essence, they capture the hidden upstream, indirect, or embodied emissions associated with the spend on a particular activity. As an example here, we look at how the EIO factor of the food and drink sector would be calculated. And each stage of the upstream life cycle of that food and drink is captured in terms of investment and emissions produced. So again, for this specific example, we may look at the agriculture and livestock stage of this, then the processing and production of that item, then the transport and distribution, and ultimately we arrive at the product that's on your table. And at each stage, we sum the investment and emissions produced to arrive at a final value for the emissions produced per pound or dollar spent on that food and drink product or service. Generally, this task or activity is not something that most organizations will complete in-house. However, here at the Carbon Trust, we have completed this task for over 400 different subsectors, and so we're well placed to be able to carry out Scope 3 footprinting in this manner on an organization's behalf. So on this slide and the next few slides, I'm going to quickly run through some examples of what we typically see to be the largest Scope 3 emission sources, and then run through some of the different approaches to how the footprint might be calculated. So firstly, purchased goods and services and capital goods. These are two separate emission categories, but there's sometimes a bit of a grey area and overlap, and so it can be hard to differentiate between the two. If we look at capital goods, these are final products that have an extended life and are used by the company to manufacture a product, provide a service, or sell, store, and deliver merchandise. And in financial accounting, capital goods are treated as fixed assets or plant, property, and equipment. In cases of ambiguity over whether a purchased product is a capital good or purchased product and service, companies should generally follow their own financial accounting procedures. You just need to make sure that this is defined early on to avoid any double counting. So that's making sure that the same emissions are not counted in both categories. If we look at the example here, the top line details a contract, a purchase good, held with company A that provides catering services. And in this example, there's no volumetric data available, so we look at the contract value, which is £100,000 in this case, and we simply use an appropriate EIO factor to then calculate the emissions. If we look at the bottom line in this example, we have a capital good where volumetric data is available. So this is the tons of cement as opposed to the money spent on that cement. And we can therefore use the more precise and accurate LCA emission factor that's specific to cement to calculate the footprint. And it's worth noting here that many organizations will likely have hundreds or even thousands of different lines of data for purchase goods and services and capital goods. And so then the footprinting can be quite a long task. And so we therefore tend just to look at the largest contributors that will typically account for about 80% of total spend. And what we find is actually this 80% of spend is usually just down to a handful of the organization's largest contractors and suppliers. Downstream lease assets. Rob discussed this category briefly earlier, but this is another large emission source, and these are properties owned by the organisation but operated by a different party. So in terms of the public sector, this category will usually include social housing or some of the organisation's other property portfolio. And under this emissions category, the most accurate way to calculate emissions is to directly measure the energy usage in that building, or to collect it from the occupier or operator of that property. And this is the case in the example here for company A. However, alternatively, if we know the type of property and its floor area, then we can use benchmark data to arrive at an expected energy consumption and calculate emissions that way. And that's what's been done here in example B. Investments. This is an emission category that we're seeing being included in Scope 3 footprints more and more often. And we find that when it is included, it's typically one of the larger emission categories. And I guess it's worth noting at this point that this is a fairly nascent area when it comes to footprinting. And although some of the methodologies are in place, they're still being developed and refined. Generally, the analysis of investments requires access to what may be commercially sensitive data. So footprinting this category may not be appropriate for every organisation. But the principle of footprinting and an investment is much the same as the other categories. If we look at it from a very high level, we simply use an EEO category for the relevant sector that the money is invested in, alongside the value of that investment within the company. Sometimes we may need some additional information about the company that's being invested in, such as revenue and enterprise value. But the result is that you'll have different emission factors that are representative of the operations of the company that's being invested in. So for example here, company A with a high emission factor may be from the oil and gas industry, and company B with a lower emission factor may be a company that works within the financial services space. Putting it all together, here is an example of a typical Scope 3 footprint breakdown. And it's fairly clear to see that purchased goods and services, capital goods, downstream lease assets, and investments form the vast majority of Scope 3 emissions. Those categories together account for about 88% of total Scope 3 emissions. And this example also sees Scope 3 emissions form about 85% of the entire, apologies, Scope 1, 2, and 3 footprint. And again, this is fairly typical for most projects that we undertake and look at, where we see Scope 3 emissions being the largest source of emissions of the different scopes. Making comparisons, it's fairly natural to want to compare your footprint against those of similar or local organisations. And while this is generally fine to do when considering Scope 1 and 2 emissions, it doesn't always make as much sense when considering Scope 3 emissions. And the reason is that Scope 1 and 2 emission sources are pretty consistent across all organisations. And benchmarking these sources against a number of employees or floor area means that you can then have metrics that can be directly compared across different organisations. And this doesn't stand so true for Scope 3 footprints, where different organisations may only consider a handful of the different Scope 3 emission categories, or all of them, or maybe even just one or two. And the reasons for this there's a range of different reasons, from data availability to your ability to influence those emissions, or whether those emission sources even actually exist for your organisation. And really, this makes the ability to compare footprints a lot more difficult as we're not going to always be comparing apples with apples. So we therefore do recommend that any footprint clearly highlights this breakdown of Scope 3 emissions by category. And lastly, on targeting, once you've measured your Scope 3 footprint, you're then able to make an informed decision on whether to set a Scope 3 target, and if you do, what that target should look like. When thinking about setting a target, there should be really three things to keep in mind. Is the target ambitious? Is it achievable? And is it cost effective? And all these three different items are dependent on each other, but it's important to find the right balance of each that's appropriate for your organization. Other key things that you may want to consider here should be what categories are being considered within your target. What's the ultimate end goal in terms of a percentage or absolute reduction from the baseline? When should the target year be? Should there be interim targets? And those are just a handful of things that you can think about when setting a target. As some guidance, the Science-Based Target Initiative, or SBTI, they state that you should be setting a Scope 3 target if your Scope 3 emissions comprise more than 40% of your total Scope 1, 2, and 3 footprint. And if that criterion is met, then any target should include at least 2/3 of the Scope 3 emissions that have been measured. So this does mean that not all emission sources that you've footprinted in your Scope 3 necessarily need to be considered within the target. What you do include and exclude, however, from that target needs to be made clear by the organisation. Different levels of ambition will determine how far the target goes and by when. As an example, under a 2-degree warming scenario, a target reduction of 40% by 2050 would probably be expected. However, more ambitious targets can be set if relevant for your organisation. And then once a target has been agreed, it's important to regularly monitor your Scope 3 emissions through annual footprinting and to track progress against that target. If you're actually wanting to reduce your Scope 3 emissions to meet your target, one of the best ways is through engaging your supply chain. And I'm now pass back to Rob, who will go through this element in a bit more detail over the next section. So over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Hector. So in this next section, we're going to dive into some tactics and methods for engaging the supply chain once you've made a start on measuring the scope, as we've gone through. So just going to talk through some broad steps needed for developing a supplier engagement program, some practical, more management level measures, and then actually what are the types of measures that need to be enacted in order to decarbonize your supply chain. So broadly, we would distill the steps in developing a supplier engagement program into 4 stages. These aren't necessarily linear in fashion, however, so it's recommended to approach these in a somewhat iterative way. But firstly, as Hector has walked you through, a certain level of screening needs to be conducted in order to prioritize areas of your supply chain and suppliers to target. Secondly, by reviewing the mechanisms in which you interact with your suppliers, you can make first steps in terms of guiding and requesting information in order to improve the accuracy of your measurement, but also to set the context for achieving carbon reductions. Next, by enacting those processes and instruments, you should move towards tracking and assessing supplier performance as per the mechanism that you've set up and other measures. And then finally, through the various measures, you can try to support and encourage your suppliers to take the actions necessary to implement carbon reduction measures. And I'll expand on each one of these steps now, just in turn. So the first step, as indicated, is to basically give yourself a manageable task by removing some of the ambiguity and breaking down the potential enormity of the task into manageable chunks. So the 80-20 rule may well be applicable, meaning that the majority of your emissions, at least in certain categories, actually sit with relatively few suppliers. And this can be your target testbed for developing your supply chain engagement program. I know that's not to say you can completely ignore others, but you do need to compartmentalize and develop different approach for different suppliers depending on that prioritization. So it's horses for courses, if you will. So in terms of the next broad step, it's really about seeking best practice from your suppliers. And one way to look at this on a public sector level is through procurement mechanisms that you have at your disposal. Now, clearly, there's a difference between what you can do with those services you already have under contract compared to those in the future. But that just really shows that starting earlier in this journey rather than later will help avoid locking in, say, a carbon-heavy contract or service or project that you will find difficult to maneuver on down the line. So thinking about some of the key steps of a public procurement cycle, firstly, how the service, the product or the project is specified in the first place is critical to the carbon credentials of its design or delivery. If there's nothing in the, say, the tender docs that says a supplier needs to deliver the service or the project in a certain carbon friendly way, say to a particular specification or a threshold, then you're really on the back foot already. So it's about getting started early with this sort of stuff. When it comes to selecting the suppliers, it would be wise to consider what are the key standard criteria involved in, say, the initial PQQ or the ITT stages. And then going through to the supplier evaluation stage, really pushing those suppliers on their carbon commitments. So, for example, does the supplier have its own carbon target in place? What sort of target is that? Does it have a carbon management strategy? Is it aligning with net zero, for example? Another key area is how the ongoing delivery of the contract is managed. Again, there'll be a difference between what they do in-house and exactly what the services they're providing to you. However, you should look to try to embed certain stipulations within contracts to mandate them to provide you with, say, their carbon emissions information, but also meet certain criteria as well. So once you've set the scene, try to contextualize how things should be moving forward, what's the direction of travel. It's important to create a system to monitor progress and to ensure requirements are being carried out. And this sort of expands on the contract management example I just gave. It sort of spills over a bit. It's a bit of a grey area. But there'll be various ways and structures on how this can be done. Broad steps you could follow within this stage would be, again, enhance your carbon emissions measurement as discussed, but then by introducing various requirements on the supplier, you can provide a framework for reference of how the supplier can manage carbon emissions. So examples here include expectations around the introduction of ISO standards, requirements around science-based targets or mechanisms such as the CDP supply chain reporting program. Obviously, the point of those sort of measures is that the organization signing up to them is seeing a reduction. So for the example of ISO 50001, the point of that is to see continuous improvement. So you'd hope to see your supplier making continuous improvement in their energy performance or alignment with a science-based target pathway. You may find with certain suppliers, that particularly larger suppliers, that they already have their own low carbon program in place. It may be that they're already thinking about or doing alignment with a science-based target or a net zero approach. And that can obviously help things and make things a bit more straightforward with those particular suppliers. Finally, you may also wish to consider third-party verification to assure that the supplier's emission inventories and their reduction claims are valid. So to close the loop on this one, then you'll very likely need to support the suppliers implementing carbon reductions. I'm not talking about making a financial contribution to a supplier's energy management measures, for example. Obviously, that would be difficult to rationalize, but there are things that can be done to facilitate the process. What level of support and how will depend on the engagement approach. One approach we recommend is conducting one-to-one initiatives with those key suppliers you've selected for further footprint enhancement. And those ones would, as we've said, be the ones that have the higher carbon impact, but potentially also ones that you have perhaps a closer, more strategic relationship with. In other instances, they may still have a high carbon impact, but you have perhaps a less warm relationship with them, so to speak. In that case, you may wish to conduct, say, one-to-many initiatives, but do it in a more focused way, perhaps with a select group of suppliers in a particular sector with a particular theme involved. Other suppliers where the carbon impact is lower, regardless of the type of relationship you have, you may wish to consider sort of one-to-many initiatives, such as basic supplier outreach, in which you can encourage them to sign up to certain, perhaps accreditations or targets as discussed. So to expand on the what a little bit more as opposed to the how in terms of supplier engagement, just a few ideas here around one-to-one and one-to-many opportunities. Where you have a closer relationship with high impact suppliers, you may be able to focus in and target certain areas of their operations, in reference to how that affects your carbon emissions. So, for example, this may relate to their Scope 2 emissions around their energy management of their operations, or Scope 1 emissions if they have a significant fleet operations that conduct a lot of deliveries or transportation on your behalf. And you can see some other examples there around renewables, looking at supporting them to switch their supply to more sustainable materials, looking at their suppliers, the tier 2 suppliers, and their product and their product design and the choices there. In terms of the one-to-many opportunities, as mentioned, you perhaps want to look at things like workshops or online forums or supplier portals, but the overall messaging on the how may not necessarily be that different to key suppliers. It's just exactly the way you go about it. In fact, you could think about staggering the engagement to use examples from working with key suppliers to show how they have decarbonized, you have reduced your Scope 3 emissions, and potentially how they've saved money and become more competitive through the various measures outlined. So engagement strategies will be supplier specific and will need to consider certain characteristics for sure. So a little bit more about here in terms of the what in reference to some of the examples and metrics we've developed with local authorities. So where waste collection is concerned, if it's done by a third party, increasing recycling, diversion from landfill, fleet management, all good stuff and important. And the target measures or metrics, that could be put in place are looking at carbon per ton of waste collected, for example, but it may be very supplier or service specific rather than just general emissions factors. Where construction is concerned, the use of lower carbon materials should certainly be targeted to reduce the embodied carbon impact. Transportation may also be part of that mix as well. And metrics for development may be something like carbon per ton of concrete, carbon per meter squared of construction. For transportation, which can be found as part of many suppliers' operations, albeit perhaps not the biggest impact. You can look at fuel efficiency and electrification. And the metrics here would be understanding carbon per kilometre or mile travelled. Social care and support, actually transport generally is the biggest carbon impact, so exploring those alternative modes of transport and reducing journeys are obviously key, and working with those, if they're third-party organisations, working with them to measure carbon against distance or even time-sheeted hours, for example. And then where broader services are concerned, it's likely that a tailored approach may be needed to understand the basic energy requirements and encourage those suppliers to begin basic GHG reporting. So just coming to the end now, a couple more slides. So I'll sum up the main points of the presentation here. So this slide shows the key steps that we see involved in becoming a public sector leader in Scope 3 management. The first is to begin your journey on Scope 3 measurement and develop the first iteration of your inventory, which is likely to include a large proportion of estimates using the proxies. As outlined, provision then needs to be made for more accurate measurement of material Scope 3 categories. You should expect to continue to utilize high-level estimations for lower material categories. How you select that largely comes down to why and what purpose you're measuring them. Next, you need to develop an engagement plan and progress metrics to track performance, to measure carbon performance, focusing on the most material categories. And for public sector bodies, this could be purchased goods, capital construction projects, leased assets, investments as well, as we've outlined. Next, moving towards setting targets with your suppliers. These need to be realistic, but you could look to use the target setting principles and standards that are available. Then it's about really engaging with your supply chain, beginning to talk with those suppliers and encourage them to report their GHG emissions, and then moving them towards tracking of service-specific metrics. Finally, being in a position then to start to understand what reductions are being made by measuring the improvements in the supply chain, and then communicating and sharing information and best practice with your peers, stakeholders, other public sector bodies and local authorities. Okay, so finally, before we take questions, we've got a little bit of time. We mentioned our framework for climate emergency support, and we're supporting a number of public bodies and local authorities across the piece in terms of climate emergency. And perhaps for those organisations that already have a handle on their strategy, we're beginning and doing a lot of work around supporting more detailed action plan development. So as part of that, we have a big focus on accelerating delivery through detailed planning, business case development, project management, procurement support, and monitoring and evaluation. So if you're struggling with some of these areas, including, of course, how to go about measuring and what to do about managing your Scope 3 emissions, please do contact us. And the details are there on the screen, and we'll be in touch. So with that, we'll stop here, and we've got a few minutes to open up for some questions.
Great, thank you, Rob, and thanks, Hector, for those insights into Scope 3 emissions. So we do have a couple of minutes left for questions, so please do send your questions in. If we don't get round to them live on the webinar today, we will get back to you via email. So the first question that has come in is, in relation to procurement, do you have examples of commonly used thresholds or specs in areas such as waste management?
I believe that the question would relate to the cost threshold or specification, but potentially it relates to the carbon amount as well. And I think we would take them on a case-by-case basis, look at what its relativity is in terms of its overall impact in terms of carbon and cost. And if we're able to work with direct emissions factors, i.e. working out sort of the supplier specific or the supply specific carbon emissions, then we would prefer to work in that manner. Hopefully that's answered the question.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, could you give some examples of a downstream leased asset? The specific example was, is a council house included in this categorization?
I'm happy to take this one, Rob. Yep. So generally, the way to define whether a property would be a downstream lease asset is whether you own and operate that building. If you do own and operate it, i.e. you're the one generally paying the bills, then that would come under Scope 1 and 2. If it's a property that you own but don't operate, then generally that would be treated as a downstream leased asset. So social housing in this instance, again, it depends on how the operation of those buildings is set up. Typically we see communal spaces and social housing, where the council will pay the bills, be included in scope 1 and 2, whereas the actual properties themselves would be considered downstream leased assets.
There may also be vehicles may come into this as well. If the authority leases a large fleet, then you'd need to understand the particulars there, but that might come into that category as well, potentially.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, do the emission factors for sectors, subsectors and services already exist publicly?
So the economic sort of wide sectoral factors, there's the open input output, the open source of emissions factors there that you're able to access. The factors that Hector talked about that we use are say an enhanced version of that, where we've updated them to, well, we keep them updated on a year-by-year basis, because we look at things like the sort of global decarbonisation of various elements across all service lines and sectors. You know, the emissions factors for a lot of things don't stay the same. So we have a slightly different version, but it's based on the publicly available open source input-output factors, effectively. Where you're talking about the life cycle assessed carbon factors, then that very much comes down to the specifics, but many of them are available, as many of you will realise that you'll be able to use the government published factors related to energy and travel and those emissions factors that you can get on the .gov site.
Great, thank you, Rob. Our next question, do you have any recommendations for sectors that involve a large overall spend but are facing barriers? And the barrier examples are things such as low operating margins, very small providers and small contracts.
I think it's quite a broad question, quite general. I suppose it would, to answer that, it's going to have to be a bit of a general answer, I think. It would very much be dependent on what those particular services are doing. So if it was lots of small construction or refurbishment businesses that were acting on behalf of your organisation, you'd have to look at what they were doing particular to the service you've asked them to do around refurbishing or building buildings, those sort of things, and then look at what are the carbon impacts involved there. And there may be things that can be done if you have multiple suppliers in the same area that have issues with sort of very tight margins in terms of delivering their service. You may be able to bring them together, perhaps to talk more collaboratively with them around things like, if it was construction, using recycled, upcycled materials, replacing standard cement and concrete, substituting normal steels for lower carbon versions, and those sort of things in the construction area, which is obviously fairly specialist.
Great, thank you, Rob. So that does take us up to 11 o'clock, so the end of the webinar. So thank you everyone for attending today's webinar on measuring and managing Scope 3 emissions. As mentioned, this is the second webinar in our Getting to Net Zero for Cities and Regions series, and information on how to register for the upcoming webinars will be sent shortly in a follow-up email, and these are focusing on deep diving on other topics relevant for the race to zero. This webinar has been recorded and we will send the recording to attendees afterwards, and we would also like to take this opportunity to raise awareness of the public sector network, which you can find on the Carbon Trust website, and this hosts useful tools and resources for the public sector. So on behalf of the Carbon Trust and our presenters, thank you for joining us today and enjoy the rest of your day.